looks like we're live. Fantastic. We've got a whole lot of people joining. So we'll just wait for a few minutes before everyone comes in. It's nice to see some familiar names joining in the live chat. Okay, it looks like we've still got a few people joining and they're trickling in. But I think probably since we're 1 minute past 7, we'll make a start. So, e whakawhataina mo tēnei wā, e whakamaumahara ngā taonga, tuku iho ngā maunga, ngā awa, ngā moana, ngā rākau, ngā manu. He tiritiri mō tātou katoa o tātou wārua te hangatanga tukotahi. Kia mahi tahi ai mō te ahau, tino pai rawa, hui e, tae ki e. No haere mai ki te hui zui, in fact, but actually it's a Substack livey. So, and this is the first Substack live that I have been involved in. So there may be some technical issues, bear with us. But tonight is all about stepping back and understanding the economic story that sits around education, the one that sort of shapes funding, policy, and all what's possible in our schools. We can't do anything without money, right? And in education, it often feels that no matter how much is invested, it is never enough, and we always need more. And we're left working with that tension all the time. So we hear a lot about constraint, but we're not always clear. We don't always have a clear sense of whether those limits are fixed or whether that's just a matter of prioritization. So as you all listen tonight, I'd invite you to hold on to that question: what is truly constrained and what is choice? And look, to help us navigate this, we are really fortunate to have Shamobeel Jacob, a familiar face to many people, chief economist at Simplicity and a regular media commentator, and just someone who is renowned for making complex economic ideas accessible and relevant to us everyday New Zealanders. So kia ora, Shamobeel, welcome along. Over to you.
Kia ora. Well, thank you for having me. I actually spoke at the union conference in Rotorua last winter, I think, down in Rotorua. That was a lot of fun. And I spoke to a group of principals out in Franklin a couple of weeks ago. So this is not the first time I've kind of talked about these issues, but I guess every time you kind of look at it, you get given a slightly different brief, as you have given me today. And I like to have different slides because I'm a sucker for PowerPoint. So what I'll do today is take you through some big picture stuff in terms of how I think about economics and the story of economics with an education lens. And then hopefully we'll have a bit of time at the end for picking up your questions. Before I get started, I just want to kind of give you a health warning, a little bit of a disclaimer. Simplicity is a financial services company. I'm not here to give you any financial advice. So if you do need any financial advice, please ask somebody qualified. There's a few rocks that I want to kind of create at the beginning of the conversation, some of the big ideas that I think are the foundation pieces for every conversation we should be having over the coming decades. The first is we are currently living in the interregnum. The world is going through a really big shift change, whether in terms of geopolitics around the world, or whether it's politics locally, or the way that we do policies, but also just really specifically in terms of how people are feeling. I feel like New Zealanders and at a point where our social cohesion is fraying and things are just not as predictable as they were. And that volatility and reduced predictability is the backdrop for our families, for our children, for us, for our economy. And I think that's the wider social, economic, political backdrop that we'll be navigating. And within this is the question that you've posed to me is when it comes to education, is it a cost or is it an investment? And the answer is it's both. In true terms, of course, it's an investment because we are investing in the future of our country and our future generations. But it is also true that that must be paid out of current taxes. And so there is always this tension in the political sphere, in the in the fiscal sphere, in terms of how do we balance it? We know that if we don't get good outcomes from education, we'll have different outcomes. But are we taking the right lens? And what I mean by that is so much of the conversation at the moment is about a zero sum kind of thinking that if I make an investment, I want that return to come back to me. And that simply doesn't work with long lived intergenerational investments like education, like infrastructure. These are investments you're supposed to make that will outlast you. And unless you have a spirit of generosity, a spirit of paying it forward, uh, it's very hard to make those judgments and very hard to make those investments. And I think we find ourselves in a very strange point in time where we have all benefited from the investments of previous generations, but it doesn't feel like we are taking the same lens to these questions at this point in time. And so I think we're at a real inflection point that we need to ask ourselves, how do we change that? Because we do need to change it. So I'll talk a little bit about the structural context because this theory of where the world is at, I think is really important for us to get a sense of. And I'm not going to pretend that I know the answers of everything that is going on, but from the outside, looking at the rhythms of history, it's pretty clear that whatever we had for the last 80 years is not what we're going to have for the next 80. And right now, I guess it's a very stark reminder. On the left-hand side is just a picture of oil prices. And it's just a reminder for me to talk about what's going on with what is literally an illegal war on Iran. And all that facade of global rules about how we might interact with each other, the sanctity of borders that were essentially agreed on after the Second World War. This is all kind of blowing up at the moment. It's all disappearing. And what that means for us is that when we think about whether it's about war or oil or national security or geopolitics, all of these are being rewritten in front of our very eyes. Everything that had been built up on the back of the First and Second World Wars is being abandoned very quickly. The question is, why is it happening? And it feels like all of this is happening suddenly. It's all happening all at once. But I'd like to suggest that that's not the case. The discontents of globalization, the discontents of inequality that has been persistent has been building for some time. The picture on the right-hand side is a picture of um, the countries that are polarized. So in the orange line is the share of countries around the world that are increasingly polarized in their politics. And what you can see there is that pretty much since the 1980s, that has been picking up. And that discontent has coincided with that period of significant economic reform that did away with a lot of blue collar jobs, a lot of rural jobs, a lot of industrial jobs. And that has led to this strange situation where, on average, we're getting much richer, but there is a long tail of people who are not getting richer. In fact, there is a growing concentration of poverty. And we know from all the research that we have done around the world, including in the data that I see in New Zealand, the biggest driver, explainer of why people disconnect from society, from democracies, is poverty. That is the fundamental driver. When you feel like the economic system, the social order doesn't deliver for you, you switch off. And I think that's what we're seeing, whether it's Trump and Trump again, whether it's Brexit in the UK, whether it's the rise of the far right, they're all expressions of the same discontent. And my theory and my suggestion to you is that this will continue for some time to come. And New Zealand has some unique features. And those unique features, I think, are partly due to the history, New Zealand had always been quite a rich country. So if you look at the picture on the left-hand side, our GDP per capita had been very comparable to Australia until about 1975. And for the last 40 years, those two have diverged. It's not that we haven't gotten richer, it's just Australia's done a hell of a lot better. Yes, it might be a little bit to do with resources and things, but lots of countries have resources. They don't all get rich. I think Australia has done something a little bit different where they have invested in themselves, in their own economy, in their own people, that has paid them a lot of dividends. On the right hand side is the inequality picture that I mentioned. And essentially, what happened in New Zealand was during the war periods, we had a lot of inequality. Then we built the welfare state, inequality fell. And then we had the reforms of the 1980s, which was meant to lead to only a short-term increase in inequality and that it would come down, but it didn't. Inequality has remained persistently high for some time. And within that, there is a growth of poverty. In my social cohesion survey last year, we found a quarter of New Zealanders go hungry sometimes or often. In data in 2023, we found that uh, families that are buying fresh food has dropped from 80 to 90% of households every week to about 60%. So we're seeing this kind of expansion of poverty in a way that really exposes that while on average New Zealand is getting richer, we're not doing as well as we used to. And number two, it's not picking up more people. And so that's really the group of people that we are dealing with, that wide range of outcomes in our communities. And it's not just that. New Zealand's got some pressing kind of near-term pressures. We've been in this very strange situation in the last decade where we've had no productivity growth. And as you know, what that means is we're just not getting richer for the hours that we work. So that growth in incomes, that average incomes, has been because we're just throwing more bodies at it. We're just working harder. We're not necessarily getting better off. And this is a very unusual situation in our history. We've not been through such sustained periods of essentially stagnation of productivity. And a lot of that is to do with the fact that we have very old technology in our businesses. We don't have people with the right skills. We have this very strange situation where we have these businesses that tell us we need more people with skills. But one, we're not going to hire them. Two, once we hire them, we're not going to train them up. And even once we do that, we're not going to give them the kit that's going to make them really productive. So we're in a very strange situation where New Zealand's got a lot of pressures that are coming together all at the same time. And this is happening at a period of also quite a lot of big social change. And it's happening for two reasons. One is because we stopped having babies in the 1970s. Our fertility rate pretty much dropped after the Second World War. You can see that in the picture on the left-hand side. And we've been below replacement rate for decades. So the fact that we have an aging population is a surprise to absolutely nobody except for politicians who refuse to do something about it. And the reason why we've been able to pretend that we don't have an issue of an aging population and demographic that's getting harder is because of what's happening on the right-hand side. We had the baby boom through the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and then we had the immigration boom through the 90s and 2000s. And as you can see, I'm a product of that immigration. There's nothing wrong with immigration per se, but when you have immigration, you also need to invest in the physical and social infrastructure of the country. Otherwise, you cannot have the social license to take people with you. And many of you will have schools and classrooms that are extraordinarily diverse. In places like Auckland, Asian babies now outnumber Pākehā babies. So we are seeing those changes that are happening, and this diversity is here to stay. And yet we know that half of New Zealanders say that immigrants don't make good citizens. The comparable number in Australia, which everybody says is more racist, is 90%. Over 90% of Australians say that immigrants make good citizens. So we are, I think, losing social license, and we are seeing this environment at the moment that's changing globally. Is socially, we're starting to see some of those fractures really coming through. And I believe some of these are as a result of the lack of prosperity growth, a lack of shared prosperity, and a very rapid change in a society where diversity has many benefits, but it also demands a lot of host communities. And I don't think New Zealand is doing it as well as it could and as well as it should. As a result, I think our politics has kind of become very strange. Our politicians want to offer us quick, easy fixes for big problems. And I just don't think that's possible. On the left-hand side is what I call my unicorn picture. And the way I think about it is when you're trying to design something, you have to pick two of those three things. Is it going to be good, fast, or cheap? You can only pick two. So either that solution is going to be expensive, it's going to be slow, or it's going to be terrible. And if you're a politician, you can't sell something expensive. It costs too much. You can't sell something slow because you won't be in power to take the credit. And it can't be terrible because nobody wants it. And so because they can't sell any of those things, they instead go, look, nothing needs to happen. Nothing needs to happen on taxes. Nothing needs to happen on debt. We're going to do just reshuffle the deck chairs and somehow we're going to get a different outcome. That is unicorn thinking. And in politics, that's what we're seeing right now. There's this extraordinary urgency to act, that we want to fix these problems. We want to be better. We want to be more prosperous. All of these things are good. But what we're seeing is that they don't have the patience, the timeline, the consensus within the political system to be able to deal with the kinds of patient long-term changes that we actually need. As a result, we're likely to see lots of unorthodox policies. And your sector has been exposed to quite a lot of it. Rapid changes that are not necessarily well considered, but you've got to get it done. You've got to get it done because you might run over your political term. But we also know if there's a change of government, many of those changes could be undone. So just because a change happens doesn't mean it's going to be durable. While we're making these very rapid changes, we are really attacking our institutions, whether it's our ministries, our public servants, or civil society organizations, unions. These are all being weakened and attacked from all sides because the only way you can make rapid change is by weakening those institutions, those things that hold you to account, those accountability mechanisms. It's all kind of being pressure cooked by this fiscal pressure that we have. Some of it is invented, some of it is real. And so as a result, we've kind of got this very ideological lens as well that kind of forces you to make decisions where you really kind of go, I don't know if we're actually talking about the same things anymore. And this all is predicated on the state of society today. So it's not like our politicians are all evil people who want to do terrible things. I personally couldn't do the job of politician. It's bloody hard work. Nobody likes you, right? It's really, really hard. But also, it's just a huge amount of responsibility with a huge amount of constraints. But our politicians are reflecting where society is. The reason why we have the kinds of governments that we have, the kinds of actions that we have, is because I think our society is fractured. Because there is no big center, because there is no consensus in a community, our politicians are going to be much more flighty. We are going to have a lot more flip-flop, a lot more changeable policies in the future. Why, as an economist, am I talking about this stuff? The reason why I'm talking about it is because when I was taught economics, I used to kind of describe the economy or was taught the economy with the stuff on the left-hand side. The economy is the function of capital, labor, and technology. And even then, we didn't look at all of it. We didn't look at things like natural capital and social capital because it's hard to measure. But a lot of the work, a couple of years ago, the Nobel Prize in Economics went to Acemoglu, Robinson, and Johnson. And their work, their life's work, was very much about, well, there are lots of places that have people with education, with natural resources. How come they're not all rich? What actually causes prosperity? And what they found was the secret ingredient to prosperity was partly to do with geography and luck. That's hard to replicate. But the things that really made a difference was your culture and your institutions. And I think hold on to their thought, because if you think about the success of a country in terms of prosperity, or the success of a business or an organization or an individual, quite often what we're talking about is core things around our culture, values, and institutions that come from it that are actually the deciders of whether we're going to have good things or bad things. To that end, though, there are some big warning signs in front of us. Whether it's in the work that I've done with the Helen Clark Foundation on social cohesion or the Edelman Trust Barometer of Trust that was put out last year, they all show this erosion of trust and social cohesion in New Zealand and around the world. So if you look at what's going on with our trust in government, less than half of us trust government. It really sped up during that period of COVID, but this is not bouncing back. So pretty much all the surveys that asked people, do you think the country is heading in the right direction? It really fell off very sharply in the second term of the Jacinda Ardern government. And then we kicked her out and got a new lot in. We don't like them either. So we're kind of stuck in this weird environment where we just don't like anybody. We don't trust anyone. And that's a very dangerous place to be for a country, because we do want to be able to come together. We do want to be able to hold a broad consensus together, because that's the foundation. And then we want to argue about the bits on the edges. And when we're not able to do that, it's really hard for us to have a stable foundation for a successful society. This is all happening in the context of the economy. I was going to look up some numbers for you. I forgot to put the chart in, but I'll talk to it a bit later. The recession has been extraordinarily disruptive. So we've had 2 years of decline on essentially in the economy. So we've had population growth, but we've had no growth in average prosperity. That's what those two charts are showing. The one on the right is probably easier to understand. That orange line is our GDP per capita, and you can see that fell over the last couple of years. It's been kind of bouncy along the bottom for the last year or so. And the forecasts are things are going to get better from here, but hold on to your hats, right? Who knows what's going to happen with what's going on in Iran? And we had the disruption of COVID, we had the cost of living crisis, and now then we had the recession, and now we have global war. So there is this kind of this rolling maul of shocks that's really caused a huge amount of uncertainty, lack of confidence, pressure on households. That's made it very, very challenging. And this recession has had a very uneven impact on different parts of society. So if you look at what's happened in the last couple of years, the job losses that we've had have been very concentrated amongst people with limited education. People with level 3 certificate, level 3 and under, they're the ones who have experienced most of the job losses, whereas those with more education have generally increased jobs even during the recession. So not uniformly so, of course. Some people have lost jobs even with those educations and qualifications. But what we do see is this divergence that's getting cemented in. And it makes sense. We see this in every recession, but it's making it even harder for people to get ahead. We're starting to see some very early signs of recovery. That's what you can see on the right-hand side. That's the number of job ads in the economy. And you can see that's picking up. And it's coming from very low base. So you really have to look quite closely to see that recovery. And we know that just with what's going on with the global uncertainty right now, that businesses might be just a little bit more careful and those job ads might not be quite as strong as it had been. But it's not just been, I guess, the economic things of COVID and interest rates. Those have all played a role. We've also had this rolling maul of inflation that's just robbed people of income growth. So it feels like our awards or our wages have gone up. But in fact, your take-home pay, what you can do with that, hasn't gone up very much. And that's what this picture on the left-hand side just tries to show you, that last few years, we've had a lot of inflation. And I've broken that inflation down across necessities of things like food, fuel, rates, insurance, those kinds of things. Discretionary products in the light green, and those government influence things like in the local government rates, what's going on with excise taxes, those kinds of things. So essentially what you can see is that inflation of the last few years have been quite high relative to history. But most importantly, that inflation has been very highly concentrated in those things you can't avoid. So people's discretionary income has gotten really, really squeezed because we're spending so much more money on the things that we can't avoid. And you can kind of see that picture on the right-hand side just in terms of what's gone on in the last decade. And essentially what you can see is the really big growth in the cost of living has been in things like rates, home ownership costs, so that's maintenance of your home, getting your health looked after, your insurance costs, your property maintenance costs, food costs, energy costs. So you go down that list and you kind of go, my God, that's a lot of stuff that's been increasing a lot relative to the cost of living. The chart I forgot to put in was the chart of the labor costs for the education sector. And essentially, it looks like education pay has gone up, but once you take account of inflation, real incomes have fallen. And that really kind of happened through that early period of COVID when we had that big surge of inflation and real incomes fell and it never really recovered. So we're going to have a really big fight on wage settings in the future because real incomes of the education sector has been pushed back so much over the course of the last few years. So we are going to have a pretty big fight on our hand in coming years. And that fight, of course, is going to be with your biggest employer, the government. And the government is on an austerity path. And of course, that's a political choice in parts, and it's a necessity in others. And what I mean by that is we have to make some choices around how much taxes we want to pay and what services we want. And both of those things are important. And the picture on the left-hand side shows you roughly how much government money the government spends. on our behalf. So on those dark green bars are what are called the operating expenditure. So that's health, education, all those things that we want to back up, all the public services we want to pay for. Those light green bars are our capital expenditure. So about spending on infrastructure and things like that. And so essentially, what happened under this national government was they came under a promise of austerity. But the first couple of years, actually, their spending rose because it's really hard to turn that down. And to reduce their kind of borrowing, what they did was they pulled back on capital expenditure, on investment in infrastructure. So that's had a really big impact in terms of where the government's austerity has come. But because there is a very strong political belief that we need to get government spending down, the forecasts are that there's going to be a lot of pressure in future years. Now, it can be quite easy to dismiss it as a complete political fancy, and I don't think it is. There are some choices that we have to make, and those choices are actually intergenerational. The reason why we're running out of money, the reason why we need to save so much money is because we've got an aging population that we have not prepared for. The fastest growing increase in government spending is, in fact, New Zealand super, and that's welfare for all people. And there's some really big pressures there that because we're unwilling to tackle that, everything else has to be squeezed. So that's what's happening. Everything is being squeezed because not only do you want to spend less from a top-down perspective, within that, we are unwilling to touch the money that we spend on things like New Zealand super. As a result, what's left over gets squeezed even more. And that creates rationing. And that, I think, is exactly what we're going to be facing in many of our sectors, including in education. So on the right-hand side, you can see that we made very conscious decisions in New Zealand over time to spend more, do more in education. And of course, that's looked different in different eras. We had quite a big increase particularly through the 50s, 60s, and 70s in terms of our tertiary education sector, trying to uplift more people. That's changed in more recent years, since the 1980s, particularly from the 1990s onwards. Of course, we've changed that model quite a bit. But as you can see, that as a share of our GDP, the amount that we spend on education is not as high as it used to be, but it's not low compared to where we were in our deep, dark history. So there's a bit of context that's needed. When we talk about, I guess, government spending and we talk about debt, sometimes these things get mixed up. And I get a little bit frustrated because debt in and of itself is not a bad thing. It's when you borrow money to pay for your everyday outgoings that's a problem. So we might argue about whether or not education spending really counts as OPEX or CAPEX, because when we educate our children well, they're an asset for the future. But it's very hard to bank on it. So as a result, we think about it as OPEX. So what the picture on the left-hand side shows you is why we borrow money at different periods in time. So those orange bars, when they're negative, we're borrowing money to essentially pay for our groceries. Those green bars are when we're borrowing money to fund infrastructure. We should always be borrowing money for infrastructure because infrastructure is going to be around for 100 years. That is the right thing to do. You always use a mortgage to buy your house, not to buy your supermarket groceries. And I think that's the challenge that we're facing. If you look at the picture on the left-hand side, there's been so many of the last decade, so many years of the last decade, where we've been borrowing money to fund everyday expenditure. And the reason why that has happened is because we are unwilling to make difficult decisions. We do not want to change the status quo, and we want to have less debt, and we want to have better outcomes. It is not going to work. And if you look at the right picture on the right-hand side, our debt to GDP, while it's not a perfect measure or it's not even a particularly troubling measure right now compared to most countries around the world, our debt looks pretty good. But our debt to GDP ratio has increased a lot. Every crisis, we are borrowing more money and we have less time, less of those good times to be able to pay it back. The last few years have been a great example, right? We had COVID, then we had a recession, now we have a war. Well, what next? Are we going to have a big fire? Are we going to have a big storm? Is it going to be something else? Well, how do we prepare? When do we prepare? And so we are going to have to make some really big decisions. And that's the really big challenge that any politician faces, is how do we convince people that we have to make some investments, we have to make some changes so that we can invest in the things that will make New Zealand a better place for future generations. And that is the difficulty right now, is when you have a zero-sum thinking, when you have people who only want things for themselves, it's very difficult to make those trade-offs. Now, the big ideas for government and politicians hasn't really changed. Fundamentally, I truly believe this, is the goal of a good society is to invest in our people, to invest in our social infrastructure and invest in our physical infrastructure. Those are the ways that we pay it forward. We benefited from those investments from previous generations. We should do this for the future ones. And that short-termism that has become so prevalent, I think, is the reason why we're struggling to hold it together, to make the right decisions. So it requires us to lift our gaze, to kind of think about not what do I get out of something, but what can I do for my children and grandchildren? And when you do that, hopefully there is a greater willingness to bear some costs and sharing some of the benefits. Because, when I go out for a walk up to the Waitakere Ranges and I look at the beautiful dam that's up there, when they built that with horse and cart, they didn't think, oh my God, this dam, is it going to be big enough for our uses in 5 years or 10 years time? The planning for that was, how much water should we be storing for Auckland 100 years in the future? And that's the kind of thinking that we have to get back into. The reason why I kind of laid that out is because that's the wider backdrop, both geopolitical and cultural and economic and fiscal. That's the context that I think education sits. Now, I'm not an expert on education, but I'll give you some of the kind of outside in view of what I think is going on. And the starting point of all of this is there is a lot of demographic pressure that's coming at us that's both going to make it more difficult, but also more important for us to be able to invest in our children. And the reason for that is the picture on the right-hand side. That shows you that essentially the way that we have our current system of taxes and spending promises, the public services, it's essentially designed as working age people contributing more and people who are young and old consuming more, right? In terms of public service. It makes sense. Young people aren't working yet. Once they're working, they'll pay tax. And once you've finished working, you should expect some dignity in old age. Nothing wrong with that. But this setup that we have now requires 4 working age people per retiree for that to work. Now, when these policies were put together by Muldoon in 1975, we used to have 8 working age people retirees. So it was like easy. We had a surplus of working people. We were in the demographic sweet spot. Everything was, relatively speaking, from a demographic perspective, easy. But today, we have 4 working age people per retiree. So already our fiscal demographics don't work out. By the end of the 2070s, we're going to have only 2 working age people per retiree. So that means the pressure on the future young people is going to be twice that we experience today and 4 times that of somebody who was a working age person in 1975. And we are going to expect so much of our young people. They are the most precious commodity that we have. And we know that we're not going to have a lot more children coming through. So these numbers on the left-hand side are just the numbers from the MOE's projections. Who knows how accurate they are. But essentially what they're saying is we are probably going to have fewer school children in the future. But it's not just that. If you look at the picture on the right-hand side, it also has big implications for our future workforce. Pretty much from here on in, we're going to have more people retiring than people entering into the workforce, becoming working age. And that means that demographic pressure within our workforce, our economy, is going to get harder and harder. And so my kind of view is that when we think about our young people, our working age people, they are going to be the most precious resource. And we need to invest in them even more. We need to look after them even more than we have done in previous generations because so much rides on their shoulders. Just at this unfortunate timing of all the anxiety that our kids face these days, all the pressures of what's going on with art in the world, with social media and all that kind of stuff, it feels like we're creating this pressure cooker situation for our children. And we have built up the system that goes, if you become educated, you can expect to have really good lifetime incomes. And the picture on the left is a bit quite busy, but essentially what I'm trying to show there is the lifetime income that's possible by qualification. So, for example, if you have no qualifications, by age 30, your lifetime income for the rest of your working life is probably going to be $1 million all up. If you're somebody with a doctorate degree, your lifetime income is probably going to be $2.5 million, $2.2 million. So there were some really important returns that were possible through education. But we also know those returns to education are getting harder to come by. And with new technologies that are coming through with artificial intelligence and automation and all those kinds of things, it's not guaranteed that every bit of education that costs a lot of money, puts you into student debt, will necessarily deliver those benefits. Not only that, not only do we not know if our higher education system is going to deliver the returns that will make it worthwhile, what we're seeing on the right-hand side is the number of students that are transitioning out of high school into tertiary education is actually trending lower. After being pretty consistent until about COVID, we've seen that really fall off. And that fills me with a lot of fear. Not because tertiary education is the be all and end all of everything, but what we also know is the number of kids that are becoming disengaged. They're not engaging in any kind of education or employment or any other kind of training. And that fills me with a lot of concern because we know that without those credentials, without the training, it's hard for them to get their head start in life, hard for them to be able to build that career progression and that lifetime of economic and social security. So there's a whole bunch of things that tell me that education matters, but that there's a whole bunch of risks that are coming through, both in terms of the returns to education and whether or not our kids are actually accessing the pathways for that education. There's also a really simple economic kind of argument in terms of why education is such a critical part of the conversation. This is just some data from the OECD, and essentially what he wanted to show you was the countries across the OECD. There's a wide variety of people in terms of how much they spend. So if you're on the right-hand side, you spend a lot on your education relative to the size of the economy. If you're up on the top, your GDP per capita is quite high, so you're quite rich. And essentially, as you know, New Zealand likes to really compare ourselves to the Nordic countries. The way I describe it is we like the Nordic countries' social and other infrastructure, but we want American-style taxes. So we kind of have this really strange situation where we don't want to pay for it, but we want the goods. What you can see is that there's a huge amount of variety in terms of how much people spend on their education, but also there is a broad kind of pattern that those countries that spend a lot more in their education tend to be a lot richer. Now, which way does the direction flow? Some people will argue that, well, they spend more money because they're rich. Well, they've been doing it for a long time. I think the causation goes the other way. It's because they have good education, because they have invested in the social infrastructure and in their people. That's why they're getting many of those returns. You can see in the Anglophone, the returns are not guaranteed. So places like Canada, it looks like they spend a lot less as a share of GDP, but they're much richer than us. Australia doesn't spend much more than us, and they're richer than us as well. So this economic argument holds, but because we like to compare ourselves against the kind of English-speaking countries, we tend to limit our vision and go, well, those countries are not spending as much as us. Why should we bother? Well, I think why we should bother is we're not seeing the outcomes that we want, and I think we can do better. So what is the theory of change from here? I think for me, the big lesson that I learned in my kind of working career is it's very easy to think about those technical solutions. Here is policy X, here is the funding Y. And if you just do those things, everything will be better. And it's true that quite often those technical solutions are really important. I was doing this piece of work with Tuhoy and for MB to try and kind of get a sense of how do we do economic policy better. And so I was, a cocky economist, went to Tanya to him and said, look, it's pretty easy. This is how you do economic policy. You have gates and ladders. Figure out what's holding you back. Stop doing those things. Find the ladders, the things that do work, and do more of those. Tamati, who was in the room, he looked at me and he said, look, Shambil, I think you missed the most important part. The bit in the box. That's the hard to do bit, the unity. If you can't build consensus, if you can't have a shared agreement in terms of how to do it, if you're not united in your approach, then those gates and ladders will not work because you'll be pulling at different directions. You'll be inconsistent and incoherent over time, and you're not going to get good outcomes. So it's very easy for us to argue that, oh, that's wrong or that's bad. But the reality is that for us to be able to get consistently good outcomes, we also have to find a way for us to coordinate in a cohesive way. Unless we can create unity to build at least some consistency and consensus, we're going to find it very difficult to create good change for our children. This was the picture that came at the end of that work. And that picture that came at the end of that work was The picture on the left-hand side, that mountain, is the picture of success for our bureaucratic friends in Wellington. The mountain on the right-hand side is the picture of success for the people of Tanyeto. Both of those mountains are beautiful, but they're completely different. And when we showed this picture, people were like light bulb moment. They're like, now I see. When we're talking about prosperity or economic success or whatever, we're actually describing different things with our words. We're not united. We're not coordinated. And when we work together, what I think more often than not we find is there is a lot more in common than we think. And unless we're able to create those opportunities for us to work together, very, very difficult for us to get those good outcomes. So I've kind of talked at you from a lot of different perspectives. And the reason why I want to do that is because there is a bigger picture here. And that bigger picture is the economic context is constantly changing. Even in the last few years, we've seen different pressures that are emerging in terms of the economy and the consequences. But what we also can see is there is a persistent inequality in our society that's reshaping our families. The experience of childhood, the experience of raising families, the experience of being in a community is being reshaped right now. And a lot of what we're experiencing in terms of that erosion, the fraying of social cohesion in New Zealand, the rise of anxiety amongst our young people, these are all interlinked. And when you've got poverty, when you've got inequality, when you've got these mounting pressures, it's unsurprising to see the level of discontent that we see amongst our people. So we are dealing with a generation that I think are under a great deal of pressure. They have a great deal of promise, but I think we are asking too much of them. We also need to be able to give them the space to be able to be children and to be able to grow and make their own mistakes. The policy environment that you and I will be dealing with is very much one of hyperpartisanship and instability. And that's because what I expect to see is rapid changes in governments. Every couple of elections, we're going to see big shifts from one big lean to another big lean. And we're going to spend a lot of time doing and undoing. That type of control Z type of policymaking, I think, is going to be really quite problematic, very damaging, because what we don't want is a system that's in a constant state of flux, because we're constantly spending time and energy just dealing with change rather than dealing with what we're trying to do, which is get good outcomes for our kids. But I don't think we should be discouraged by that. If we understand that wider environment is one of change, we need to think about what is it that we do in our own organizations, in our own work as teachers, that gives us the ability to create stability and security and consistency. I think we can still do that. But it's about not being swayed by the external forces only, because we do have to respond to them, but also finding out how we do it. It's not just what we do, it's how we do things. And the question for me is not so much that I know how to be a good teacher or what to do, but I think it's really about asking ourselves from our own kind of vantage points is how do we chart this new course? It's very easy for us to think about those technical things that we do, the approaches that we have taken in the past. But the question is not so much whether we keep doing those things, because I think we'll be required to do something different. The question is, given what we want to do in terms of being able to educate our children, to be able to create better lives for our children and future generations, how do we do that as professionals in whatever profession that we're in that gives us the ability to do that? I think it's a question that's really worthy of deep contemplation, because we know that the bigger picture demands that of us. There aren't any easy answers here, and I don't think we should expect them. But the conversations that we'll engage in, the kinds of learning that we will have over the coming years, I think will make us better stewards of future generations. I think that's really what's being asked of us. As the world becomes more unstable, as unpredictable, we have to create those centers of security and stability within our control and within our grasp. So that's all I had in terms of prepared remarks. I'm very happy to take questions.
Shamaville, that was phenomenal. And as clear, I think, as pointed out in that last comment, you just get a question in your head, and then suddenly you have a slide that answers exactly what we were thinking. But to start it off, you talk about that short-termism, and that's a real challenge. We see that in the swings in political cycles, and we see that in curriculum. We move from one extreme to another. Someone from overseas has commented at an international conference, "Oh, you're from New Zealand, the pendulum country." where we go from the left to the right and we rarely hit the middle. So in terms of short-termism being the state we're in, is that a political choice, or is that something that we can actually leverage at a system level to make changes?
Look, I think there isn't a pithy answer to that, because the system of democracy that we have has become hijacked by the minor parties. And so policies are much more extreme than they should be, than they need to be. Because I don't think the types of policies that are being pursued at the moment are necessarily agreed on by the majority of New Zealanders. I just don't agree, don't think that's true. But we find ourselves in that boat. And as a result, I think we are going to find a lot more swing. But the task for us isn't just to speak to the politicians. I think our task is to also speak to New Zealanders, because I really do think New Zealanders have a lot more in common than we have in difference. But our politicians, use that and leverage that difference, those small differences, and turn them into big things. When it comes to our children, I think by and large, our politicians and our public are more willing to do the right thing. So if there is evidence and there is a consistency of evidence across the political spectrum, then that is likely to provide better outcomes. Unfortunately, I'm seeing even that being quite politicized at the moment. Some crazy people inside of ministries and whatnot who are doing work kind of go, why do we have this clearly ideological person who's creating things in public policy? I think there's some problems there, but I don't know quite how to solve it. But I feel like I don't know whose job it is, right? But I think as a sector, as unions, as Ministry of Education and others, I think we do have to think about creating an evidence base that is somehow at least a little bit removed from the politics and based on the evidence.
Yeah, definitely. That hits at it. It's this. Some people say, well, perhaps a 4-year term for an electoral cycle will help to alleviate that. I don't know if it would, because you're still in this constant state of trying to vote grab, right? And
I have this
stay in
fight
power.
with my boss. So Sam and I disagree on this a lot. He really believes a 4-year term will make everything better. And I kind of go, well, you know, we did great things in our country with 3-year terms in the past. So there is no reason why we can't do it again. The difference, I think, is there is just a rush. So you're right in that I think if we had slightly longer terms, New Zealand is very unusual. New Zealand, Australia, very unusual in having 3-year terms. 4-year terms is kind of the typical for the OECD kind of countries. But even if you had 4-year terms, when you have a government you don't like, then that's doing terrible things. That extra year could do much more damage, right? So,
Yeah,
so
yeah,
it's hard to kind of go hand on heart. I can tell you that a longer term is going to get better outcomes. I just don't think that's true.
yeah. No, that's and as some of the comments that are coming through, 4 years of bad doesn't feel better. It really hits the mark. If you were I'm thinking from the point of view of Treasury. Okay, so is there something that we need to know about how Treasury works in order that helps us to understand what comes through to education in terms of vote education or dollars? What's the cycle? How far ahead should we be lobbying for things so that they are in place, then that then they can come to fruition?
Look, I've never worked in the Treasury, so my answer is probably not going to be very good. I pride myself in having been out of the public service for most of my working life. And it's not because I don't respect the public service, it's because the private sector pays a lot more money. The issue for me is I don't think it's Treasury that's making these decisions. I think they've become much more politically driven. So yes, Treasury is important because it's the bean counter of the government and it matters. But I just don't think they're nearly as powerful as they used to be. So yes, they're in charge of saying no to things, but I don't think they're the ones who are that powerful in terms of doing that. So the lobbying, the pressuring that you want to do is probably more to do with the public and the politicians rather than the Treasury. The Treasury will do the bidding of the government of the day, as any public servant should.
Yeah. I want to pick up on that point coming through. There's a theme of inequality, And for us as educators, we tend to extrapolate out. We see achievement um, primarily being driven by inequality and outcomes. And what you mentioned around inequality in society is a key indicator. Can you expand on that? And are there places around the world, is a universal basic income something that is something that could fly?
It could. Look, I mean, if we made everybody less poor, then it would have great outcomes. It just requires a lot of money. Given that we can barely make decisions to pay for the things that we want, it's very hard to see, where we are in New Zealand today, where we might give out money to poor people. So, unfortunately, people just don't like poor people in New Zealand. We have a very anti-poor bent to us as a society, and I think that's a very hard thing to hear, but it's true. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of punching down that goes on. So
Yeah.
yeah, I hear you, but I just don't think we are willing to raise taxes to a level that would be required to have a UBI. I think maybe the focus should be on actually fixing what we've got. We also already have welfare policies that have become mean and grudging over time. I mean, our welfare payments now, if you're a single mother, you are destined to poverty, right? You are living below the poverty level. I was looking at the numbers today because of the oil shock. And a typical single mother will spend half of her income on rent and power. When do you pay? How do you pay for fuel? How do you get to work? How do you get to school? How do you do all of the other things? It's an extraordinary situation. So I think that poverty is probably better dealt with what we had with a welfare system that was sufficiently generous for people to actually have a safety net to bounce out. Now we have a welfare system that probably creates more of a poverty trap. So I'd probably say that that's a more achievable target rather than something big and beautiful like a UBI.
Yeah, I mean, after all, they just have to work harder, don't they? That's the narrative. Just work harder and it will be better.
And
Yeah.
completely contrary to all the evidence. I don't know if you ever read any of the work by Esther Duflo or Poverty by America. Great book. Just you know, poverty it's like a cancer, right? It just spreads and it kind of debilitates. It's a terrible affliction. And it's a trap. And we know this. We've known this forever. And the only solution to poverty is money.
Yeah. Yeah.
It-
And if we
we-
go back to the Prime Minister at Waitangi talking about equality of opportunity does not mean equality of
oh,
outcome, because that's
that's
socialism, right?
ridiculous. It makes me so angry, that kind of
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
That language of equality of opportunity just completely misunderstands what equity is about. The fact that you actually have to make investments to resolve these things. We have so much evidence. I mean, this is not a controversial thing. It's like, it just blows my mind that even now we somehow think that somehow people are just going to get, richer if we just let them be.
Yeah.
It's just not true. It's just get really frustrated.
And that equity piece is something that educators live and see every day. We see it in our kids that come into the classrooms, that walk through our doors, and we make adjustments and we do things. The number of teachers that are bringing in lunches, the number of teachers that go in and fill up a pencil case or things along those lines. That's the hidden cost of the stuff that we're subsidizing as educators to help try and alleviate that problem. Um, I think that we've got a couple more minutes. We've got about 7 minutes left. And it looks like there are a few questions there, but I think we're pretty much covering it. What you've given us in that presentation is a lot of food for thought. Is there anything that, okay, so you are the Grand Tsar Emperor of Aotearoa, New Zealand. Is there anything that you would do to pull on the strings and make things a bit better for everyone?
Sure. It's a really good question. I get asked that a lot, and there are no immediate solutions. I think the investment we need to make is actually in community. And the reason I say that is because, that breakdown of social cohesion is actually taking place in communities and in neighborhoods. At schools, you guys see that a lot more than most people. Most politicians don't get to see it in the same kind of way, or businesses or anybody else. Um, I've recently been doing a documentary and been traveling through Tokoroa and Balclutha, just interviewing a whole bunch of different people. And the most fascinating thing that I've heard wasn't so much about these external pressures. Of course, they affect all of us. But the thing that gives them the ability to kind of do something different, despite people's differences, is that ability to kind of just come together as neighbors or as friends. And to me, that's the bit that is the magic of what I'd like to see in unlocking New Zealand, because I don't think there's anything we can do at the top level that we'll have justification for or long-term support for. Yes, let's say I'm a prime minister for 3 years. I make a whole bunch of changes. Do you think they'll last? And so I think what we want to create instead is that stability and that a consistency of change that's led by community champions, supported by social support in that local community. When I was talking to with the high school in South Otago, some of the programs where they're doing was just really exciting, and it was done with the support of the local community. And that two-way flow of support meant that there was a local support, consistency, and coherence that just lasts despite that economic cycle or the political cycle. And I feel like that's the bit we want to invest in. How do we do things that are more enabling of people to get on, connect with each other? So it's not a very good answer, because I don't think it's an easy thing to do. I think, like, I don't know about you, like growing up, I went to sports and you met lots of different people and you understood your community from a different perspective, not from your little silo. And I think that was a really important experience of developing a sense of identity and community that was bigger than yourself. And that's the bit that I think we need to earn back. And I just don't know quite how to do it. I suspect it involves teaching of civics and other things at school, but not just that. It can't just be about, why don't the teachers teach more? I think there is a lot more stuff we need to do in community as well. So
Yeah.
it's a half-assed answer, really, but it's because I think it's a really hard question.
Yeah. No, it is tough. I think the challenge that we all have is that we see so much waste, and we see so much waste in what's spent in education with the changing pendulum. You've got maths books that come in that may not be being used. We've got all sorts of things happening, and that's frustrating for school leaders. It's frustrating for teachers. And I think probably what we're calling for is just to be in the room helping to make those decisions. But it's not us that gets people into power, is it? It's the general public.
But we are also the public, right? And I
Yeah.
think, and you are of the community and in the community. And I think therein lies the beauty of what our educators do.
Yeah.
Is you're not just an educator, you also run a business and you also run a community enterprise, right? I think there is so much on you, and hence the job has so much pressure.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think it has opportunity as well, because
Yeah.
I think the conversations we have, the spaces that we create, and the opportunities we create, there are, I think, potential avenues to do things a bit differently. I think our school spaces and school communities are bigger than just education.
Yeah.
And it's hard to do that.
Yeah. And so is there some things that school leaders and teachers can be saying to whānau that reinforces that aspect of community, that aspect of what we could all do together if things would change? I mean, do we throw in wealth tax?
Look, the way I think about it is there is no one big policy idea that you should be going out to try and fix. I think it's much more about that progressive thing about how do we give the community permission to engage with us, to use us as a place to meet, as an opportunity to meet and to mingle. My kind of lesson of, again, Tokoroa and Balclutha was, these are unlikely heroes that came together because of circumstance. And because of that, they were able to bring their different skills together to do something to a good end. What they did in terms of some of the training programs in Balclutha was really exciting. They went and talked to the businesses, and the business said, "Look, we have vacancies. We just can't be. We're discouraged. We don't think anybody's going to fill them." And they said, "Well, if we train these people up, will you take them?" It's like, hell yeah. And they said, "Okay, we'll train them up. We'll find the kids, we'll train them up, and we'll bring them to you, and you give them a job." And they did. So it didn't require the teachers to go and do it, but it required the teachers and the educators to be in the room, to be involved in some of that stuff. I hear you where you're coming from. You want something a little bit more present. I think you want something a little bit more immediate. I just don't know if we have those tools in front of us.
And look, definitely my dogs love the idea of a wealth tax. They went ballistic as soon as I say it. Um, I've trained them well. Look, we are about a minute away from our scheduled time. So, is there anything you'd like to leave us with that you might have in the back of your head thinking, should I say that? Should I not? Is there something that we may head away with thinking about that we could ponder?
Look, I'm a very depressing kind of guy. So, I'd just like to say thank you for the work you do. I think, your work is extremely valuable. The reason why people teach is because they love children and they love the future of a country. And I think if you can hold that very close to your heart, everything becomes a lot easier. It's not always going to be like this. You're not the only ones who are facing these pressures. We're all living through the same things. But I think you feel it more acutely because you can see the consequences on our children. So I think keep that close to your heart that, you are appreciated. What you do is important. And we're all going through the same thing and we will find a way, but we have to work together.
Brilliant. Kia ora, Shamaville. Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone who's joined us tonight. This will remain on the AEC Substack page, so it can be revisited. But we really appreciate you giving us an hour of your time. That's an amazing gift that you have given us, so thank you. Kia tauturanga mari e, kia hore te marino, kia whakapapa paunanu te moana, kia tere te karo hiruhi I mua I te huarahi. Thank you all very much for joining us and have a very good evening.